break, and so I'm now going to hand over to Andy Barker from Butterfly Conservation, who's going to talk about butterfly recording over the last 20 years. Andy, your slide's up.
Okay, yeah, I can see that now. Okay, so Bob Annell is also listed in the credits here because he's the county butterfly recorder. He provided quite a few of the graphs, or most of the graphs in the talk. So next slide, please, Wolfgang. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this talk is really a combination of a bit of a flavour of how things have changed in recording over the last 20 years, but also a look at a few examples of how the butterflies themselves, or a few species, have changed in their status and distribution. Now, one thing you can see from this slide is the fourfold increase in the number of records we get in. Back in 2002, we used to get about 30,000 records a year. Now we get about 120,000. The next slide, please. And if you look at these, you'll see that there's a range of different sources. We don't have the detailed breakdown before 2010, but if you look at butterfly transect recording, you can see it's up to now about 60,000 records a year. So that's about half the records. And if you look at big butterfly count, which I'll come on to in a bit, that is about 30,000 records a year, which is a quarter of the records. So I'm going to have a look at some of these in more detail. So next one, please, Wolfgang. For those not familiar with the butterfly transect recording methodology, it's not just ad hoc recording. This is actually a monitoring technique. So it's a much more scientifically relevant and robust technique rather than just simply going out recording butterflies randomly. And the map on the left shows a site that was set up last year, a new transect at Shawford Down, just south of Winchester. And what you can see is the route, which is broken into a series of sections. There's 8 on that particular transect, but it varies between transects. And the idea is, with the method, you have to stick to the same, walking the same route every year. And it's walked once a week from the beginning of April to the end of September. So that's 26 weeks in total. And the sort of graphic in the middle, black and white, showing a person walking in a 5-meter box, is supposed to represent what you're recording. So you have sort of 2.5 meters to your left and right, 5 meters ahead and 5 meters up. And any butterfly that comes through that imaginary box as you walk along is what you record, someone there recording. And last year, we had 346 volunteers that were involved in butterfly transect recording in Hampshire. And quite a few of those are involved in more than one transect, and many of them run on rotors. So there's a big number of people involved in this. But the great thing is, because it's a standardized methodology, you can draw comparisons year after year at the same site. You can compare between sites, relative change, and you can also compare regionally and nationally, because everybody around the UK is using the same method. Indeed, it's international now. A lot of countries use the same methodology. Next slide. This map shows the active transects in Hampshire, which are the red dots, and you'll see that in South Hampshire and the west we're well covered, but central to north we could really do with a few more. A lot of those areas are limited public access, not many footpaths, a lot of it's farmland, but we could really do with a bit more geographical coverage in certain areas. But having said that, Hampshire is the most transect monitored county in the whole of the UK. We really have got loads of them. And you can see in the 20 years since HBIC started, 2002, we had 60 transects, which then also was the most of any county. Now with 3 times that, 180. There are more transects registered, but they don't all necessarily run every year. We've been trying to build a few more on the Isle of Wight, and those yellow dots are ones where I've got a route in mind that I think would work. If any of you live in those areas that are not well represented, or can recognise somewhere that might be near to you, then please let me know, because we can maybe get something started. Next slide. Because we use this consistent methodology from year to year, what you can do is then obviously make direct comparisons. This graph here shows the cumulative transect data. So that's all of the Hampshire transects added together for silver-studded blue. The transect weeks are the numbers that are in the background there, but I've put abbreviations for the months just to make it easier for you, because I appreciate most of you don't know what week 12 is, or it's difficult to work out. So you can see If you take the silver-studded blue, it's a heathland species. Hampshire is fortunate to have this butterfly in good numbers on its heaths. Nationally, it's a scarce species. But you see the difference between 2020, which is the line which forms a spike in June. In 2020, it was an early season, whereas last year, because of a cold April, the flight period of this butterfly was delayed, and so you can see it was skewed more to early July was the peak. Also notice the peak is lower, so it wasn't such a strong year. You can add up the area under the graph if you want to get the absolute amount. Next slide. This isn't Transect data, but I just wanted to use it to show, the previous slide showed about how for one year to another, obviously the weather conditions can vary, and so things can emerge early or late. I think anybody for range of taxonomic groups would recognise that 2020 was early, 2021 was a late season, relatively. This is from general data sent in, just showing how the pearl-bordered fritillary butterfly has started to emerge earlier and earlier. So the vertical axis is the day of the year, and I've put some examples down there of what those numbers represent, just to help you. So 118 is the 28th of April, for example, so just below that line. But what I want you to notice is that before 2005, almost all of the records were in May, and some of them were well into May for the first emergence of that butterfly. There were just 3 dots in April, whereas you look post 2005, you can see that there's a lot of April first emergences of that butterfly. In fact, you know, probably 70% of the records there. And there has been a progressively earlier emergence of this species on average. Of course, 2021, you can see, was a slower year, but on average, getting earlier and earlier. Next slide. Same's true for the Glanville fritillary. Now, maybe you say that's not really a Hampshire species. Well, it is sometimes. We've had it at Hordle cliffs and down at the Hurst Castle around there. It used to be just on the south coast, more or less, of the Isle of Wight, but you can see from the map that it's spread more throughout the island. It's more regularly seen even on the north of the Isle of Wight now. And once again, if you look at the graph at the top, you can see how the species is getting earlier and earlier. Not so much of a difference between 20 and 21, but again, the red dot was 20, the blue dot was 21. And again, this one's getting about a day earlier every 2 years. So that's quite a quick change for this species. Next slide. This is Transect data, and I use this example to show you how for a single species, and because the Transect data is gathered in this consistent way, you can draw comparisons for individual sites compared to the average for Hampshire and compared to the average for England. So on this top graph, and it's a logarithmic vertical axis, so 1 represents 10, 2 represents 100, 3 represents 1,000. It's a log to base 10 scale. And what you can notice is, if you look in 1997, so this is going right back, this butterfly on Transect, and if you took one Transect like Magdalen Hill down, it was recorded in hundreds. Yeah, so it's above the 2. Whereas if you take it at its lowest point in 2008, it was below the 10 mark. It was about 3 or 4, and so was the average for Hampshire. Now, I just wanted to show you the lower graph as well, which shows you the strength correlation between these different sets of data to show, if you look at the yellow triangles, that is Hampshire Isle of Wight average plotted against the horizontal axis of England, and the correlation or the linear regression figure is 0.96, which is incredibly high. For anybody who knows anything about the statistics, anything above 0.5 would be good. So a correlation of 0.96 is very strong. And similarly, if you look at one individual site, Magdalen Hill Down, which is the blue diamonds, the strength there is also strong, 0.88. So that's just an individual site. It's very consistent with the pattern for Hampshire, and the pattern for Hampshire is very consistent for the pattern for England. So these things that are happening with this butterfly are something that we can show are both locally, nationally, and regionally something going on. Haven't got time to go into that, but parasites are one of the possibilities. Next slide. Well, big butterfly count has been a big thing that has encouraged a lot of people to get involved. This is a citizen science project, and it used to run just for a short period. I think it was more or less a long weekend, end of July, early August, but because the weather can't always be relied upon, I think it runs over 2 or 3 weeks now to give people the chance to submit their records. Next slide. And this is the same graph I showed earlier, but I've stripped the transects away so you can see more detail on the recording methods that are recording slightly lesser amounts. So the big butterfly count launched in 2010, really increased, and you can see from it's up to about 30,000 records a year, which is about a quarter of what we get. So this is citizen scientists. The next slide. And one of the things, the method is just written at the top there. You spend 15 minutes in a sunny spot, see what you can observe in terms of butterflies, count them, and then you can submit your records, either direct to Big Butterfly Count or there's an app you can use. And you can see here that there's also a few moths. And although my talk is primarily about butterflies, I wanted to just have a little bit on the Jersey Tiger Moth, which is one at the bottom right-hand corner. Really beautiful moth, day flying moth. And thanks. And this one, you can see it's about the same size as a small tortoiseshell. Next slide. And what you can see, if you look at the top map, the inset, the grey one in the top left, this is from Barry Goter and Tim Norris's publication, The Moths of Hampshire and Isle of Wight in 2001. So this is sort of around the time HBIC started. And this was pretty well unknown in the county. A few records on the Isle of Wight, but just 2 dots you see there for Hampshire. Whereas the one with the blue squares, you can see is the map present day, showing it's very widespread across the island and increasingly common in South Hampshire, particularly coastal areas, and even records up into North Hampshire as well. If you look at the map on the right, you can see that it's really common now in Greater London area. Previously, it used to just occur in a small area of South Devon, more or less, was its total distribution. But over the last decade, it's spread eastwards, and you can see how it's come into our region, Hampshire and Isle of Wight. But it's a very common species in Greater London now. It likes the warmer climate, I think, and that sort of heat island effect you get in the city. So that one's become really common. It probably is climatically linked. Next slide. The other big thing that has really got people involved in recording butterflies, people that hadn't been involved before, is the I Record Butterflies app. And here you see a picture of it there, and there's a video to tell you how it works and so on. Next slide. And here you can see from its launch in 2014, the I Record Butterflies now, lots of people, as well as the Big Butterfly Count, they're using this app. And what it's there, about 13 or 14,000. So if you say we had 120,000 a year in 2021, right thereabouts, at least 10 or 12% now of the records are coming in from the I Record app. I'm not going to talk about all the other different methods, so MapMate, spreadsheets, living record, but you can see that they're along the bottom. They're not, haven't really taken off as much. So the I Record app and Big Butterfly Count contribute quite a lot now in terms of records. Next slide. Well, we've looked at records per year, 120,000. How about recorders per year? Well, back in 2002, the number of recorders was only about 200 or 300. If you look at 2009, we've got up to about 400. And if you move on to now, we're up to about 4,000. So we've got about a 10-fold increase since 2009. Big Butterfly Count, I put an arrow when that was launched, and we've got this I Record app. So that's really engaged with a much wider audience. So back in the time when HBIC started, it was a small hardcore of entomologists that were sending in butterfly records. But nowadays, you've got 4,000 people that are sending in records. Next slide. And in terms of the coverage of the county, the tetrads are 2 by 2 kilometre squares, and you can see that I think there's roughly 1,200 Hampshire and Isle of Wight, and you can see a map for the large white there. The red, this was taken from our 2020 butterfly report. The red dots were records from 2020, and the blue dots were ones within the decade post 2010. So you can see it's pretty well covered, and we do get a record of some sort from 75 to 80% of all the tetrads every year. So the coverage is really good now. Okay, large white's a common species, but you can see that the coverage is really good. So 80% of the tetrads per year is a great thing. Next slide. Well, this is the last bit, so hopefully I'm sort of reasonably well on time. But this is showing the brown hairstreak butterfly. Now, for those of you who attended last year, you will have seen a version of this. I talked about butterflies and climate, and whether this rise of this butterfly in Hampshire is due to climate. Well, who knows? But certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, it's really increased. It used to be just found in the Noar Hill Nature Reserve, and those 3 dots, Noar Hill happens to straddle 4 tetrads. So it's really just one site, but it just happens to be across 4 tetrads just about. Whereas the Shipton Bellinger colony in the border with Wiltshire is a small population from a much bigger one that is established in Wiltshire, and that's always been another good area. So look at the bottom, you see the number of tetrads per year. And what I wanted to highlight here is a combination of a genuine spread of the species, but combined with, certainly over the last couple of years, increased recorder effort. So it's a bit of a combination, but it is genuine spread of the species, and it's been found to be spreading elsewhere in the UK. Now, surprisingly, it may seem, one of the best ways to survey for a fairly small butterfly is to survey for its eggs, which are pinhead sized. They're quite easy to find in the winter, and there's a little small inset at the bottom of a couple of eggs on blackthorn. It's an easier way to find the presence of a species in an area than to survey for the adults, which are very elusive. But you can see there's been good effort over the last few years, and the number of tetrads with this butterfly have increased. So Wolfgang, if you'd like to just click and advance in a sort of slow and steady way, that a sequence of maps will appear. So if you do the first one, so there's 2010, not too much change, a few other dots appearing. Next one, 2015, still broadly the 2 areas, but a few more dots turning up. Next, 17, you can see it start to spread a bit more. 18, next one, see it spread a bit more, really turning up in the Soberton area, the area that's sort of southwest from the Noar Hill peak, so in the sort of southeast Hampshire area. There's a sort of area around Soberton, around the back of Portsdown Hill, which is really turning them up. And if you take the next slide, you can see how that's really strengthening. So there's a real population there. The species does occur in West Sussex and also Surrey, so it's not surprising in a way that it's edging. And look how strong it's getting up in the Shipton, Bellinger and Andover area. And 2020, you can see it's really pushing on. And finally, 2021 is covering the area. And if you're wondering, well, why aren't there red dots in amongst all that blue? It's because I think the hardcore surveyors are trying to push out the boundaries. So they're not really bothering about going over the ground they've been on. So Shipton Bellinger is always popular, and Noar Hill. But I'd like to highlight that southeast Hampshire area. So around Wickham and back of Portsdown Hill, Southwick Estate, all that sort of area, they're sort of really becoming strong now. And I'm just waiting for them to turn up in central Hampshire a bit more, but maybe it'll come. And that's just really highlights the value of lots of recorders and really good coverage and lots of quality data to understand how species are changing. And that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much.